Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are looking at a moment in history that is so incredibly fragile, so utterly dependent on a bizarre sequence of accidents, mistakes, and coincidences that if you wrote it as a fictional movie script, no studio executive would ever believe it. We are talking about June 28, 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. This is the single literal spark that ignited the catastrophic powder keg of the First World War. We have all heard the basic story in high school history class. An archduke is shot, alliances are triggered, and suddenly the entire world is plunged into 4 years of unprecedented trench warfare. But the actual minute-by-minute narrative of how that day unfolded is profoundly bizarre. It is a story of incredible incompetence, sheer dumb luck, and a few teenagers who managed to change the course of the 20th century forever.
It really is the ultimate butterfly effect in human history. You have a regional political dispute in the Balkans, you have a handful of radicalized, incredibly inexperienced teenagers armed with pocket bombs and pistols, and you have an Austro-Hungarian heir apparent who was remarkably stubborn about his public appearances and refused to listen to security warnings. And out of that highly localized, incredibly specific set of circumstances, the entire global order collapses. 4 mighty empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the German, and the Ottoman, are completely destroyed by the resulting conflict. 20 million people lose their lives in the mud and the gas of the trenches. The global map is completely redrawn, setting the stage for World War II and countless modern geopolitical crises that we are still dealing with today. And it all traces back to one street corner, one wrong turn by a chauffeur, and 2 bullets fired from a small Belgian pistol. To truly understand how this single event could possibly cause such a massive global cataclysm, we have to pull back and look at the terrifyingly fragile geopolitical house of cards that existed in Europe in the early 20th century. We need to look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is this massive, sprawling, multi-ethnic conglomerate right in the heart of Europe. It is ruled by the aging Emperor Franz Joseph of the House of Habsburg, who has literally been on the throne since 1848. He is a living relic of the 19th century, an incredibly conservative monarch ruling over an empire that is internally tearing itself apart. The empire contains Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs. Nationalism is the rising religion of the era, and all of these different ethnic groups are starting to demand autonomy or outright independence. The empire is a boiling cauldron of ethnic tension, and the most volatile area by far is the southern region, the Balkans. Exactly. And the most problematic neighbor for the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the Kingdom of Serbia. Serbia had recently achieved full independence from the Ottoman Empire, and they had adopted a fiercely expansionist nationalist ideology. They looked at the southern Slavic populations living inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, particularly in the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they believed those people and those territories rightfully belonged to a greater Serbian state, or a pan-Slavic nation, which would eventually become Yugoslavia. The tension reached an absolute fever pitch in 1908, when Austro-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Serbs were completely outraged. This annexation crisis nearly started a European war right then and there. Russia backed Serbia, but Germany backed Austro-Hungary, forcing Russia to back down in humiliation. The Russians vowed they would never back down again. So right there, the tripwires of the alliance system are heavily armed. And into this hyper-volatile environment steps Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph and the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne.
Franz Ferdinand is a fascinating and often deeply misunderstood historical figure. He was not a particularly warm or popular man. He was known for being quite gruff, highly autocratic in his personal manner, and he was an obsessive, almost fanatical hunter who shot literally hundreds of thousands of animals during his lifetime. But politically, Franz Ferdinand was surprisingly pragmatic and forward-thinking. He understood that the Austro-Hungarian Empire could not survive in its current form. He realized that the dual monarchy system, which gave power only to the Austrians and the Hungarians, was alienating the massive Slavic population. So he championed a concept known as trialism, or sometimes referred to as the United States of Greater Austria. He wanted to reorganize the empire into a tripartite state, elevating the Slavs to have equal standing with the Austrians and Hungarians. He genuinely wanted to grant them more autonomy to keep them loyal to the Habsburg crown. And that is the great irony of his assassination. Franz Ferdinand was probably the one man in the top echelons of the Austro-Hungarian government who was most sympathetic to the grievances of the Slavic people, and the one man most actively trying to prevent a war with Serbia. The chief of the general staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, was basically demanding a preemptive war against Serbia every other week. Franz Ferdinand consistently blocked him. But to the radical Serbian nationalists, Franz Ferdinand's proposed reforms made him far more dangerous than a warmonger. The nationalists feared that if Franz Ferdinand succeeded in giving the Slavs equal rights and autonomy within the empire, the Slavic populations would become content and happy. They would stop wanting to break away and join a greater Serbia. Therefore, to the radicals, Franz Ferdinand's peaceful reform was a direct existential threat to their dream of a unified South Slav state. He had to be eliminated to keep the revolutionary fire burning. This brings us to the radical elements operating within Serbia, specifically the incredibly secretive and ruthless military society known as Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, which translates to unification or death. History remembers them by their more ominous popular nickname, the Black Hand. This organization was founded in 1911 by a group of radical Serbian military officers, chief among them a massive, physically imposing man named Dragutin Dmitrijević, widely known by his terrifying codename Apis, the Egyptian bull god. Apis was the head of Serbian military intelligence. He was a master conspirator who had already orchestrated the incredibly bloody May coup of 1903, where Serbian army officers broke into the royal palace, brutally murdered the unpopular King Alexander and Queen Draga, mutilated their bodies, and threw them out a window into the palace gardens. Apis operated almost entirely outside the control of the civilian Serbian government. He used his position in military intelligence to establish a network of border guards, smugglers, and informants, funneling weapons and propaganda into Bosnia to destabilize Austro-Hungarian rule. And Apis and the Black Hand did not usually carry out assassinations themselves. They preferred to use proxies, radicalized youth who could be easily influenced and, if caught, completely disavowed to maintain plausible deniability. They found the perfect proxies in a student revolutionary group operating inside Bosnia called Mlada Bosna, or Young Bosnia. This was a disorganized collection of high school and university students, mostly of peasant background, who read anarchist literature, idolized political martyrs, and passionately hated the Austro-Hungarian occupation. The most critical figure within this group, the young man who would actually pull the fatal trigger, was a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. Princip's background is absolutely crucial to understanding his state of mind. He was born into immense poverty in a remote village called Obliai. His parents had 9 children, but 6 of them died in infancy. Princip himself was tiny, physically weak, and incredibly sickly. He had contracted tuberculosis, which in 1914 was essentially an absolute death sentence. He knew he was going to die young.
That fatalism is the driving force behind Princip. He is a dead man walking, and he wants his short, miserable life to mean something monumental. He moves to Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, to continue his education, and there he immerses himself entirely in radical coffeehouse culture. He spends his days drinking cheap coffee, arguing about philosophy, reading poetry, and talking about liberating the Slavic people. He becomes obsessed with a man named Bogdan Jerajic, a young Serb who had attempted to assassinate the Austro-Hungarian governor of Bosnia in 1910. Jerajic missed his target and then immediately committed suicide with his final bullet. In the eyes of young Bosnia, Jerajic was not a failure. He was the ultimate martyr. Princip would secretly visit Jerajic's grave in Sarajevo, place flowers on it, and swear that he would one day follow in his footsteps. So when word reaches the cafes of Belgrade in early 1914 that Archduke Franz Ferdinand is planning to visit Sarajevo, Princip and his close friends see it as a divine opportunity. The news of the Archduke's visit was actually printed in the public newspapers months in advance. The visit was scheduled for June 28, 1914. This date is absolutely pivotal. June 28th is St. Vitus Day, known in Serbian as Vidovdan. It is an incredibly sacred day in the Serbian national calendar. It marks the anniversary of the epic Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where the Serbian kingdom famously fought to the bitter end against the invading Ottoman Empire. Even though the Serbs lost their empire that day, it became the foundational myth of Serbian national identity, symbolizing ultimate sacrifice, defiance against foreign occupiers, and the eternal promise of resurrection. For the Austro-Hungarian heir apparent to parade through the capital of an occupied Slavic province on Vidovdan in the uniform of a foreign military conqueror was viewed by the Serbs as an arrogant, deliberate, and unforgivable provocation. It was like spitting on their most sacred historical altar. It is debatable whether Franz Ferdinand intended it as an insult.
The date was primarily chosen because he was serving as the Inspector General of the Armed Forces, and the Austrian military was conducting scheduled summer maneuvers in the Bosnian mountains. The maneuvers were set to end in late June, so a brief ceremonial visit to the capital city of Sarajevo seemed like a natural conclusion to the trip. Furthermore, June 28th was exactly the 14th anniversary of his marriage to his wife, Sophie Chotek. Their marriage was a famous point of contention in the royal court. Sophie was a mere countess, not a member of a reigning European dynasty. Because of this, Emperor Franz Joseph only allowed the marriage on the strict condition that it be morganatic. This meant that their children would never inherit the throne, and Sophie was subjected to endless, humiliating court protocols. She was never allowed to sit next to her husband at state dinners, she could not ride in the royal carriage with him in Vienna, and she was forced to walk behind the lowest-ranking archduchesses at public events. But when Franz Ferdinand acted in his military capacity as Inspector General in the provinces, those strict Viennese court rules did not apply. In Sarajevo, Sophie could finally ride beside him in an open carriage as his equal. He wanted to give his wife this rare moment of public dignity on their anniversary. It was a tragically romantic motivation that put them directly in the crosshairs.
Meanwhile, back in Belgrade, Gavrilo Princip and his closest co-conspirators, Nedeljko Čabrinović and Trifko Grabež, make contact with Black Hand operatives. A shadowy Black Hand major named Vojislav Tonkosić provides them with a terrifying arsenal. 4 sophisticated FN Browning Model 1910 semi-automatic pistols, 6 small rectangular handheld bombs filled with shrapnel, ammunition, and capsules of cyanide so the assassins could kill themselves after the deed to ensure they would never reveal the conspiracy. They undergo a brief, incredibly amateurish period of target practice in a park in Belgrade. They are terrible shots. Princip is the only one who shows even a basic aptitude for hitting a target. Through the secret Black Hand smuggling network, often referred to as the Tunnel, these 3 teenagers, completely armed to the teeth, are successfully smuggled across the border from Serbia into Bosnia. They make their way to Sarajevo, hiding the weapons in the homes of sympathetic locals, and they recruit 4 more conspirators locally to help them carry out the plot. By the morning of June 28th, there are a total of 7 assassins deployed along the Archduke's planned parade route. The morning of June 28th, 1914, dawns bright and sunny in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie arrive in the city by train after a brief stay at a nearby spa town. The security arrangements for this visit are, in hindsight, shockingly almost criminally negligent. Despite the well-known presence of radical separatist groups, despite numerous vague warnings of plots from the Serbian government itself, the local Austro-Hungarian governor, General Oskar Podiorak, wants the visit to appear extremely relaxed and welcoming. He wants to prove to the emperor that Bosnia is safely pacified under his command. He explicitly refuses to call out military troops to line the streets, arguing that their uniforms would offend the local civilian population. As a result, in a city of over 50,000 people, there are exactly 120 local police officers assigned to guard the entire multi-kilometer parade route. The royal couple climbs into the second car of a 6-car motorcade. The car is a luxurious, custom-built Graf and Stift double phaeton sports car, and critically, the convertible roof is rolled entirely back so the crowds can see them perfectly. The motorcade begins its slow journey toward the city hall down the Apel Quay, a long, straight, wide avenue that runs directly alongside the Miljacka River. Among the cheering crowds lining this avenue are the 7 assassins, spaced out at regular intervals to maximize the chances of a successful attack. They are nervous, sweating, and carrying lethal explosives in their pockets. As the Archduke's car slowly approaches the first assassin, a Muslim carpenter named Muhammad Mehmed Bashik, the tension is unbearable. Mehmed Bashik is standing near a prominent bank building. He has a bomb ready. But as the car draws level with him, a policeman unexpectedly steps right behind him. Mehmed Bashik completely loses his nerve. He freezes, does nothing, and simply watches the motorcade roll past. The first opportunity is squandered. But just a short distance down the road stands the second assassin, a 19-year-old printer named Nedeljko Čabrinović. Čabrinović does not freeze. As the motorcade approaches the Chumioja Bridge, he takes the small rectangular bomb out of his pocket. These specific bombs had a 10-second chemical delay fuse. You had to strike the percussion cap against a hard surface to ignite it, and then wait a few seconds before throwing it. Čabrinović strikes the bomb against a nearby lamppost. The sharp crack of the percussion cap echoes loudly over the cheering crowd. Archduke Franz Ferdinand actually hears the crack, turns his head, and sees this small dark object flying through the air directly toward his open car. In a split second of pure reflex, Franz Ferdinand raises his arm to protect his wife. The bomb strikes the folded-back convertible roof of the Archduke's car, bounces completely off the vehicle, and rolls underneath the wheels of the third car in the motorcade following right behind them. The 10-second fuse runs out. There is a massive, deafening explosion.
The blast completely destroys the third car, severely wounding two of the Archduke's military officers inside, Count von Buss-Walduck and Lieutenant Colonel Erich von Moritzi, and injuring roughly 20 civilian bystanders in the crowd with flying shrapnel. Chaos instantly erupts. The motorcade violently screeches to a halt. Smoke is billowing everywhere. Chabrnovich, realizing his attempt has failed and that he is about to be captured, desperately tries to execute the Black Hand's final order. He pulls out his vial of cyanide, swallows the poison, and vaults over the stone embankment, throwing himself down into the Milyacha River to drown. But here, the sheer dark comedy of errors continues. The cyanide he was given was old and expired. Instead of killing him, it only severely burns his throat and induces violent vomiting. Furthermore, it is the middle of a hot, dry summer. The Milyacha River is suffering from a massive drought. Instead of plunging into deep water to drown, Chabrnovich lands face first in exactly 4 inches of muddy water. He is lying there, vomiting, completely alive, as the angry crowd and the police swarm down the riverbank, drag him out, and nearly beat him to death before taking him into custody. Back on the street, Franz Ferdinand acts with remarkable coolness. He steps out of his vehicle, checks on the wounded officers, and commands the motorcade to continue to the city hall at high speed. As they speed past the remaining assassins, including Gavrilo Princip, the cars are moving entirely too fast for any of them to take a clear shot or throw another bomb. Princip assumes the plot has entirely failed. He is devastated. The Archduke arrives at the city hall, visibly shaking with absolute fury. The poor local mayor, who had prepared a flowery welcoming speech, begins to read from his notes. Franz Ferdinand aggressively interrupts him, shouting, "Mr. Mayor, I come here as your guest, and you greet me with bombs? It is outrageous." Eventually, Sophie calms him down, and they proceed with the reception. But now a critical debate occurs. What should they do next? The original itinerary called for them to visit the local museum and then have lunch at the governor's residence. General Potiorek, deeply embarrassed by the security failure, begs the Archduke to leave the city immediately or to at least wait for military reinforcements. But Franz Ferdinand stubbornly refuses. He insists on altering the route to visit the local hospital to personally check on the 2 officers who were wounded by the bomb blast. This decision to visit the hospital requires a massive change to the planned route. They decide the safest way to travel is to drive straight back down the exact same road they came on, the Apple Quay, at high speed, completely bypassing the dense, narrow streets of the city's center. It seems entirely logical. But in an act of staggering administrative incompetence, absolutely no one communicates this route change to the Czech chauffeur driving the Archduke's car, a man named Leopold Loika. Nobody tells him. The motorcade sets out again. The lead car, carrying the chief of police and the mayor, reaches a major intersection at the Latin Bridge. According to the original, obsolete itinerary, they are supposed to turn right here onto Franz Joseph Street to go to the museum. The lead car turns right. Chauffeur Loika, following the car in front of him, turns the steering wheel and dutifully follows them right onto Franz Joseph Street. General Potiorek, who is riding in the car with the Archduke and Sophie, realizes the catastrophic mistake immediately. He leans forward and shouts at the driver, "What is this? Stop, you are going the wrong way. We are supposed to stay on the Apple Quay." Loika panics. He hits the brakes hard, bringing the large, heavy vehicle to a complete stop right in the middle of the crowded intersection. He then tries to put the car into reverse gear, but early 20th century automotive transmissions were incredibly clunky. The gears jam, the engine stalls. The open-top car carrying the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire is perfectly stationary, essentially a sitting duck, stuck right outside a popular delicatessen called Schiller's.
And who happens to be standing on the sidewalk right outside Schiller's delicatessen at that exact precise moment? Gavrilo Princip. There is a very famous historical myth that Princip was inside eating a cheese sandwich, lamenting his failure, and just happened to walk out as the car stopped. That sandwich detail is almost certainly a later historical fabrication. The reality is that Princip, having heard the bomb earlier and seeing the cars speed by, knew the original route would eventually bring the Archduke near this intersection. He was simply lingering in the area, bitterly disappointed, trying to figure out his next move. Suddenly, the crowds part, and directly in front of him, mere feet away, the Archduke's car miraculously stalls.
It is an impossible stroke of dark luck. Princeps cannot believe his eyes. He reaches into his coat pocket, grips his Browning pistol, and steps swiftly forward through the crowd. A nearby police officer actually sees Princeps draw the weapon and lunges forward to grab his arm, but someone in the crowd, potentially a Black Hand sympathizer or simply a panicked bystander, violently bumps into the officer, knocking him off balance. Princeps raises the pistol and fires 2 shots in rapid succession from a distance of barely 5 feet. He originally intended to shoot the Archduke and then General Podgoric, but in the chaos his aim shifts. The first bullet strikes Archduke Franz Ferdinand directly in the neck, cleanly severing his jugular vein and embedding itself in his spine. The second bullet penetrates the side of the car and strikes Sophie in the abdomen, severing a major artery. The silencerless cracks of the pistol ring out loudly. Princeps instantly turns the gun on himself, trying to shoot himself in the head, but bystanders tackle him to the ground. He drops the gun, pulls out his cyanide pill, and swallows it, but just like his comrade, the poison is expired. It only makes him violently ill. The mob descends on him, punching him, tearing his clothes, attacking him with walking sticks. A police officer has to draw his sword and strike a civilian to prevent them from literally tearing Princeps limb from limb right there on the pavement. Inside the car, it takes a moment for the reality of the situation to set in. Because the Archduke was wearing a rigid, heavily padded military tunic, he remained sitting perfectly upright. General Podgoric initially thought the assassin had missed entirely. The chauffeur finally manages to engage the gears and aggressively floors the accelerator, speeding away from the horrific scene. But as the car accelerates, the awful truth becomes apparent. Sophie slumps over sideways, her head falling heavily between her husband's knees. General Podgoric thinks she has merely fainted from the stress of the gunfire, but Franz Ferdinand knows better. Blood is rapidly pouring from his neck, staining his bright blue uniform. In one of the most heartbreaking moments of this entire historical tragedy, the dying Archduke looks down at his wife and utters his final desperate words. He pleads, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Those were his last coherent words. Count Herrick, an officer who was standing on the running board of the car, grabs the Archduke by the collar to keep him from collapsing completely and frantically asks him if he is in immense pain. The Archduke weakly mutters, "It is nothing. It is nothing." He repeats this phrase 6 or 7 times, his voice growing fainter with each breath as his lifeblood flows out onto the floorboards. By the time the speeding motorcade reaches the governor's residence, the situation is completely hopeless. Sophie was likely dead before the car even stopped moving, having bled to death internally almost immediately. The Archduke's aides frantically attempt to cut open his heavily tailored uniform collar to stop the bleeding, but because he insisted on being sewn tightly into his tunic for a perfect military fit, they cannot access the wound quickly enough. Within roughly 10 minutes of the shots being fired, the Archduke's breathing completely stops. The heir to the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire is dead on a leather couch in a provincial administrative building, killed by a teenager with a pistol.
The immediate aftermath in Sarajevo is pure, unadulterated chaos and horrific mob violence. As soon as the news of the Archduke's death spreads, organized anti-Serb riots explode across the city. Mobs of angry Croats and Muslims, loyal to the Austro-Hungarian crown, begin systematically destroying Serbian-owned businesses, looting homes, smashing school windows, and lynching prominent local Serbs. The Austro-Hungarian military eventually has to impose strict martial law just to stop the city from completely burning itself to the ground. Meanwhile, Gavrilo Princip and the other conspirators are violently interrogated. Because they are amateurs, the entire conspiracy unravels incredibly quickly. The police quickly follow the trail of the weapons back to the border guards, back to the smugglers, and ultimately back to the shadowy military intelligence networks in Belgrade, Serbia. Austria-Hungary finally has the perfect, undeniable excuse it has been waiting for to completely crush its annoying Serbian neighbor once and for all. Back in Vienna, the hawks in the government are absolutely ecstatic. Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf immediately begins pushing for an immediate punitive military invasion of Serbia. However, they know that attacking Serbia will almost certainly draw in Serbia's massive protector, the Russian Empire. Austria-Hungary cannot fight Russia alone. So they send a diplomatic envoy to Berlin to ask their powerful ally Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany for explicit support. On July 5th, just a week after the assassination, Kaiser Wilhelm makes one of the most catastrophically reckless diplomatic decisions in human history. He issues what historians call the blank check.
He promises Austria-Hungary that Germany will support them completely in whatever action they choose to take against Serbia, even if it results in a massive war with Russia. With this guarantee of German military backing, the Austro-Hungarian diplomats sit down and draft a deliberately unacceptable, utterly humiliating ultimatum to the Serbian government. This document is dispatched on July 23rd, almost a month after the assassination. The ultimatum demands that Serbia publicly condemn all anti-Austrian propaganda, suppress all nationalist publications, completely purge its military and government of anyone vaguely associated with anti-Austrian sentiment, and, most incredibly, allow Austro-Hungarian police officers to operate freely on sovereign Serbian soil to conduct the assassination investigation. They give Serbia exactly 48 hours to accept these terms unconditionally. The Serbs are terrified. They actually agree to almost every single demand, humiliating themselves to avoid annihilation, but they reject the single point about Austrian police operating on their soil, arguing it would entirely destroy their status as an independent nation. They offer to submit the single disputed point to the International Court at The Hague, but Austria-Hungary does not want a diplomatic solution. They want a war. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after Gavrilo Princip fired those fatal shots, Austria-Hungary formally declares war on the Kingdom of Serbia. The artillery bombardment of Belgrade begins the very next day. And once that first declaration is issued, the rigid, mathematically precise alliance system of Europe kicks in automatically, acting like a massive, unstoppable doomsday machine. Russia, claiming it must protect its Slavic brethren in Serbia, begins a massive general mobilization of its vast army. Germany sees the Russian mobilization as a direct existential threat to its own borders and declares war on Russia on August 1st. Knowing that Russia's ally, France, will inevitably attack them from the west, Germany decides they must strike France first to avoid a two-front war. They launch the Schlieffen Plan, a massive invasion of France through the neutral country of Belgium. The completely unprovoked violation of Belgian neutrality absolutely outrages the British public and forces the British Empire to declare war on Germany on August 4. Within a single, dizzying week, a regional dispute over a political assassination in the Balkans has violently dragged every major global power into the most destructive war humanity had ever seen up to that point. Millions of young men are boarding trains, cheering, believing they will be home by Christmas, completely unaware they are marching into the mechanized slaughterhouse of the 20th century.
And what happens to the young assassins who started it all? During their highly publicized trial in October 1914, Gavrilo Princip and his co-conspirators remained completely defiant. They used the courtroom as a platform to proudly preach their national ideology, insisting they did the right thing by killing a tyrant. Under Austro-Hungarian law, a criminal had to be 20 years old to receive the death penalty. Princip was exactly 27 days shy of his 20th birthday when he pulled the trigger. Because of this technicality, he could not be legally executed. Instead, he was sentenced to the maximum penalty of 20 years in solitary confinement at the freezing, damp fortress of Theresienstadt in what is now the Czech Republic. The conditions were absolutely barbaric. He was kept in a tiny, unheated, perpetually dark cell. He was routinely starved and subjected to psychological torture. His tuberculosis aggressively worsened in the damp conditions, eating away at his bones. Eventually, his right arm had to be entirely amputated due to a severe skeletal infection. He died in agonizing pain on April 28, 1918, weighing less than 90 pounds. He died just a few months before the end of the devastating war he had single-handedly started, completely unaware of the true scale of the global horror he had unleashed. It is deeply chilling to reflect on how vulnerable human history really is to random chance. If the driver had been informed of the route change, if the car had not stalled exactly where it did, if the first bomb had been thrown a second earlier, the entire trajectory of the modern world would look completely different. There might have been no First World War, no trench warfare, no Russian Revolution, no rise of fascism, and no Second World War. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand serves as the ultimate terrifying reminder that massive global structures can be utterly destroyed by the smallest, most unpredictable miscalculations. A single teenager with a pistol and a wrong turn on a summer morning in Sarajevo truly set the entire world on fire. The sheer chaos in the streets of Sarajevo was just the beginning. The Archduke and his wife were dead, and the assassins were in custody, but the real catastrophe was brewing hundreds of miles away in the halls of power. Austrian leaders wanted revenge, but they knew attacking Serbia outright would likely draw on Russia. Exactly. That is where the infamous blank check comes into play. In early July, Germany told Austria that they would unconditionally support whatever action they chose to take against Serbia. It was a massive diplomatic miscalculation. Germany thought a swift Austrian strike would keep the conflict localized. They vastly underestimated the tangled web of European alliances. And let us talk about that ultimatum. Austria deliberately designed a list of demands that were so severe, so utterly humiliating that Serbia could never accept them in full. They wanted a pretext for war. But surprisingly, Serbia agreed to almost every single point, except one that would have severely violated their national sovereignty. Even Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany saw the Serbian response and reportedly declared that every reason for war had vanished. But the military machinery was already in motion. Austria severed diplomatic ties and declared war on July 28th. The spark had caught fire, and the mobilization schedules of the great powers took over without hesitation. Russia began mobilizing to protect Serbia, which triggered Germany to declare war on Russia. Because France was allied with Russia, Germany initiated their invasion plan, crossing into neutral Belgium to bypass French defenses. That violation of Belgian neutrality was the final straw that brought the British Empire into the fight. It is staggering to realize how quickly the dominoes fell. Within a matter of weeks, a localized assassination in the Balkans transformed into a global bloodbath. The tragic irony is that Franz Ferdinand himself was one of the loudest voices advocating against war with Serbia, knowing it would likely destroy the empire. His death removed the primary obstacle to the very war he feared. The diplomats and monarchs truly believed the boys would be home by Christmas. They had absolutely no concept of the mechanized slaughter that awaited them in the trenches. The modern world was effectively born in the gunfire of that Sarajevo summer.
Exactly right. That single morning shattered an entire century of relative peace. The assassins could never have known that their erratic plot would directly cause the fall of 4 massive empires and completely redraw the map of the world. Millions of innocent soldiers marched toward their own inevitable destruction because of one solitary bullet fired from a pistol. It remains the most consequential and disastrous turning point in our shared human history.